What's up, guys? Justin here with the CGEssentials.com. So if you're anything like me, you've got a number of different tools in Blender that really make your life easier that you use over and over again. This video is going to talk about some of the things that I think are essential for you to know moving forward working with Blender. So if you're new, you're just learning Blender, these are things that you need to know. Let's go ahead and just jump into it. All right, so number one, 3D cursor. So this is something that people kind of overlook and they kind of skip over when they first get started with Blender. But there's this little cursor looking thing that's inside of your 3D workspace that actually drives the way a lot of things work in the program. So first off, you can position the 3D cursor by clicking right here and then clicking on a point in your model, or you can also do a shift right mouse button and place the 3D cursor that way. So that's how you can move it around. There's also some more advanced tools if you tap Shift S, which we can talk about a little bit later. But the 3D cursor is important because it's used as a reference point in a 3D space. So for example, let's say I do a Shift A and I want to add a monkey, right? If I click in here to add a monkey, notice how that monkey gets placed wherever that 3D cursor is inside of a 3D space. So this allows us to set a specific reference point. And so let's say we wanted to move this to another point. So what you could do is you could do a shift right click like this in order to set that point. That gets interesting with snapping, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but you can do a Shift S. And notice how there's options in here to either move things like your selection, what you have selected to your cursor, or to move your cursor to things that you have selected. In this case, I can click on selection to cursor, and that's going to move the object and place its origin point wherever your 3D cursor is in a 3D space. Okay, so next up is using views. So right now, for example, let's say that I wanted to create something that came up off the ground, like a post or something like that, right? So if I come in here, I can try to place the 3D cursor, but I can't really tell where it actually is in a 3D space. So let's say I wanted to create something that was along this green line. So if I do a Shift A and I add like a cube and then I rotate around, I was pretty close, but I'm not directly aligned on this line. It's very difficult to tell where something is in a 3D space, just from like a perspective view like this one. Luckily, we've got options in to go to preset viewports. And so you can either use this gizmo right here, or you can use your numpad and type keys like 7 or 9 or 1 or 3. So you can use that to go into those different views. But however you get there, what this allows you to do is this allows you to be much more precise with your placement, right? So if you're trying to place something that's on a certain level, for example, go into this front view right here. Well, when you go into this front view, what it's doing is it's locking your position on the red axis when you're in that front view so that you're only moving something around on the green and the blue views. So if I go into this front view and I move this around, it doesn't matter where I put it, it's going to maintain that same X location. And you can actually see that if you tap the N key and look at this object. Notice how if I move it around, that X location isn't moving. So if we were to go to a top view, it's going to lock the Z location like this. And so moving things around in 3D is a lot easier if you set them on the front and then on the side and then on the top, because then you can be precise as opposed to just kind of like moving things around in a 3D space because you never know where it's actually going to end up. So I know exactly where things are going to end up with this view. All right, so in addition to using the views, you can also use inference locking in order to move things quickly. So like right now, for example, if you tap the G key in this view, let's say that we want to move this just along the green axis. And so if I want to move this along the Y axis, for example, I can tap G and then Y like this. So what that allows me to do is that allows me to lock the direction. You could also tap X to lock it to the X or Z to lock it to the Z. This gets really interesting with snapping, which again, we're going to talk about in a minute, but you can also exclude axes by holding the or by tapping the Shift key in a direction. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to move this around, but I didn't want to change my view, and I wanted to lock the Z axis, right? Well, with the move active, so when I tap G, if I do a Shift Z, notice what that's going to do is that's going to lock this so that the Z axis doesn't change. If I do a Shift Y, it's going to lock the Y. If I do a Shift Z, or Shift X, it's going to lock the X. And so you can use this for a lot of interesting things. Like for example, if I want to scale this object, right now if I tap the S key in edit mode with this active, it's going to scale around the central point, right? like this. However, if I tap the X key, it's going to lock this so that it only scales on the X axis. If I tap Y, it's going to lock it on the Y. So you can use inference locking in order to do a lot of different things inside of Blender. All right, so the next thing that I think a lot of people don't understand is I don't think they understand that objects have an origin point, and it affects the way that operations do things inside of your model. Like, for example, if I look at this monkey head, right, and I select it, notice how it's got this little dot in here. Well, the dot is going to affect all of the operations having to do with this object. So right now, this is centered on my object. So if I scale this, right, it's going to scale about this central point. So whatever your object origin is, this is going to set that. However, if your object has an origin point that isn't centered on your object, so let's say, just for a second, if I was to place my 3D cursor here, I was to go to Object, Set Origin, and I was to do Origin to 3D Cursor, right? What that did is notice how that dot moved all the way over here. Well, now all of your operations are going to be based on that point. So now, if I scale this, for example, notice how it's scaling based on the point that's over here. And so that can be really frustrating if you don't know what that means, because now all of your stuff is acting very odd, right? It's acting very strange. And so you can adjust that either by going into Object and doing a Set Origin. And notice how I can set my origin to a center of mass. For example, it'll set this to the center of mass of my object like this. Or there's another way to affect origins, which is under your options right here. And so when you click on options, and notice this only works in object mode, but if you check the box for affect only origins and then tap the G key, for example, I can move the object origin around manually. So let's say that I wanted this object origin to be right here. For whatever reason, I could move that over here, and then I could toggle this off. Well, notice how now all of my operations are based on where that is. All right, and so this is more important as you start getting into more complex applications, right? So let's say, for example, that I was scattering trees using a particle system on this surface. Well, if your object origin is in the middle of your object, so if I set my origin to my center of mass like this, notice how it's going to place those based on that origin point. So having control over that origin point is really important because it's going to affect the way things interact in Blender. So notice how if I take my original object, affect my origin, I'm going to move this down until it's at the bottom of this object right here. Now these particles are being placed properly inside of my scene. So having an understanding of the way origins work is going to make your life a lot easier inside Blender. All right, so next up, geometric detail is important. And what that means is, let's say that I wanted to take this object right here, which is just a simple plane. And notice if I tab into edit mode, there's nothing special about it. And let's say I wanted to bend it using this simple deform modifier. So I just want to take this whole thing and I just want to bend it in some direction. It doesn't really matter what direction right now. Well, notice how this isn't really bending it. It's more like oddly scaling it, right? It's taking these ends and it's just kind of scaling them together. And so the reason for that is because there's no geometric detail in here for Blender to actually know what to do with this. It's basically using math to figure out where the point should go if this was bent. So let's say I was to do the same thing to this object, but for this one, I'm going to tab into edit mode, right click, and subdivide it. And I'm going to go ahead and subdivide it to a number of 10, something like that. So now we've got geometric detail in here. They look exactly the same otherwise. So if I toggle this modifier off, notice how they look the same, but they're not. Because now, and so if I come in here and I use the simple deform modifier now, notice how I'm getting this more like curved shape right here. Let's say we were to switch this to like a twist, just to get a little bit more information. So notice how this object is twisting along that axis. If I was to come back here and switch this other one to a twist, notice how I'm not getting a whole lot of additional detail because it only has these 4 vertices to work with. So adding additional geometric detail in here can be really important to get things to work the way that you want. All right, so another thing that trips a lot of new users up inside of Blender is applying your rotation and scale. And so let's say, for example, that I have 2 boxes right here. I'm going to take one of them and I'm going to scale it along the x-axis like this. So if I take this first box, tab into edit mode, and do a Control B to bevel it, it's going to do exactly what you would expect, right? It's going to apply a uniform bevel around the outside of this object. So it's very uniform around the whole outside, right? So all the corners are the same size All the bevels are kind of the same size, other things like that. However, if we do the same thing, so I'm going to tab out of edit mode, and I'm going to move over a little bit. I'm going to tab into edit mode on this object that I just scaled, and I do a Control B and try to bevel it. Notice how we're getting this like crazy stretching effect in here, right? So we're getting this crazy stretching effect, which is making our bevel not look very good. And so the reason for that is because when we were in object mode, we scaled this object along the x-axis, right? So if you look at this, the scale of this object is 5.15. So if you make a change to an object inside of object mode, so anytime you do any kind of scale or anything like that, it's applying or it's adding this x scale to the, call it the outside of the object. However, if we were to go in here and we were to go to object, apply rotation and scale, like this, what it's going to do is it's going to reset the scale value of the object back to whatever it originally was. So now, if I tab into edit mode, do a Control B to bevel, notice how my bevels are nice and uniform, where this one was not. All right, so see how this gives us a much better result? So if you ever have something that's not acting as expected, like it's distorted or anything like that, make sure that you take that object, go to Object, Apply, Rotation, and Scale. All right, so next up, we've got one of the essential navigation tips that most people miss in Blender. And so for me, this one is super important, and it's snapping. And so let's say that we wanted to align this cube with the top of this object right here. Right? That can be a little bit tricky. So you can kind of get in here and get close, but it's not exact. So I can come in here to the elevation view, tap G, Z, and then try to align it to the top. But if I want it exactly aligned, it's a little bit difficult unless you toggle on snapping. So you can toggle snapping either by clicking on the little magnet right here or by doing a Shift tab. And then you can click this little drop down to see different kinds of snapping that this has. Well, in this case, I pretty much, most of the time, I use vertex snapping. What that's going to do is that's going to take an object and it's going to snap the vertices so that they have the same value. So, for example, let's say I was to tap the G key with my mouse over here. Notice how with that snapping turned on, this is actually going to try to snap the two closest vertices together, and I get this little circle around my cursor. So if I move this to the bottom, notice how it's trying to move to the bottom. So this can be super helpful. One place I use this a lot is actually if I want to align like the top of an object, I can do a G, Z to lock it to this axis, and then I can just align it with the top right here, because it's basically taking my closest vertex, which is a top vertex, and aligning it right here. So you can use this in order to take objects and align them really quickly. So like I said, I use this a lot. So it just makes aligning objects so much easier in Blender. Okay, so another thing that you're going to find yourself doing a lot of is trying to find the center of an object. And usually when you create an object like this cylinder, for example, it's going to come with the origin centered on the object right here, but not always. Sometimes you'll get something and it'll be, let's say the origin's like way off to the side or something like that. So if you want to find the center of an object, an easy way to do that is to go to your object, set origin, and you want to go to origin to geometry. And notice how in this case, this brings us to the center of your object. And so there's two options in here. There's median center and bounds center. So bounds is going to find the center based on the outside boundary of an object. Median center, I think, is just finding an average right here. But you can use that in order to find the center. Well, then I'll usually couple this with something like snapping, where I can move this down to the bottom point right here, and I can use that to find the very bottom center of an object inside of Blender. And so you can kind of combine those together. Like for example, let's say that I was to add a plane. I'm going to scale it on the Z axis, and I'm going to move it out. So I'm going to scale it in, I'm going to move it out this way, like this. Well, what I want to do is I want to use the rotation. I want to use the array function in order to array this in a circle. So what I would do is I would add an empty. At this point right here, I would add an array modifier to this object, and I would do an object offset instead of a relative offset. You don't need to know all of this. I mostly just want to demonstrate what we might use this for. So we might want to do a rotational array like this. Well, notice how right now, remember how we talked about applying rotation and scale? Well, this is another example of where applying rotation and scale will fix this weird issue that I'm getting right here. So now if I take this and I apply my rotation and scale like this, now it's going to allow me to create an array based on this point. However, what we want is we want this to be arrayed based on this central point. Well, remember, one of the tricks that we talked about was taking the object origin and setting the origin to our 3D cursor, which is at the center of mass. So now we can take this and we can rotate it like this in order to create this array. So these things kind of start building on top of each other inside of Blender. All right, so another thing you're going to want to be able to do is do advanced selections in Blender. So advanced selections is going to save you a ton of time. And there's a number of different things you should know about this. All right, so the first tool I think a lot of beginners don't know about is the pick shortest path tool. So let's say that I wanted to select all of these boxes right here, right? So I could come in here and I could do a shift click in order to select all of these, but that's a little bit time consuming. What we can do instead is if we click on one box and then we tap the control key or hold the control key and then click, what this is going to do is this is going to pick the shortest path between what you have selected and the next object you have selected. So I can just click in here and I can do a control click, control click, control click in order to use a path in order to select different things inside of my model. So you could also hold control click and move this over here, but notice how the path that it selects can always be a little clunky. Now, if you do check this box for face stepping, that's going to allow it to pick the shortest path between one point and another without worrying about making sure it's kind of uninterrupted. So you can check that box in here if you want to do that. Usually I use this for more like linear selections like this because it can be a massive time saver. All right, so in addition, you can also, if you tab into edit mode again, you can select by edge loop by holding the Alt key and clicking. So notice how, for example, if I hold the Alt key and I click on this vertical right here, what it's going to do is it's going to select based on any edge loops that it can find. And you can dictate the direction by clicking on the top or the bottom. So notice how when I do this, what this is doing is this is trying to find the uninterrupted edge loop around the object. Now be aware with something like a UV sphere, that's only going to go until you run out of quads. So notice how at the top, for example, this goes into a tri, so it's a three-sided shape, so it kind of loses that. So be aware that if you do have something that runs out of quads, then it's not going to work as well. The other thing you can do is you can also do an Alt click, and then you can hold Alt and Shift in order to select multiple different edge loops in here. So notice how I can come in here and I can select these different edge loops really quickly. And so then I can do something interesting like tapping the E key and then tapping the S key in order to extrude this outward. And I can do like a Shift Z in order to lock the Z value in here. So once you can get those complex selections really quickly, it allows you to do really interesting modeling things like this. And so the last thing a lot of beginners struggle with is camera placement. And so if I set this up and go to render image, notice how it's not actually rendering what's in my scene, right? That's because the camera and what the camera sees is what's being rendered. So when we click on render image right here, it's basically rendering what that camera sees. And so if you try to move your camera around manually, it can be very frustrating, right? To try to get what you want, you can do some trial and error stuff and kind of like try to look through this whole thing, but it doesn't really look very good. So if I do a render image now, notice I'm closer, but I'm definitely not where I need to be. However, there's a trick that you can use where you can select this camera and then you're going to hit the numpad 0. So it's the 0 on your numpad. So what that's going to do is that's going to take your viewport camera in. It's going to bring it in like you're looking in this camera. So now you can see exactly what's going on with this camera view. However, there's a second step that's going to make your life even easier, which is if you go to view and you want to look for view lock inside of view, what you want to do is you want to lock your camera to your view. Well, once you do that, when you're inside of the camera, you can use this in order to place your camera view like this. And one other trick is if you uncheck this for a second and hit the home key. So if I mouse over this and hit home, what that's going to do is that's going to expand your camera view to fit your whole scene. So now if I do a lock camera to view and I move this around, that's going to allow me to quickly place that camera. Then I can tap that numpad 0 again to get rid of that. But now if I render through this camera, notice how my image is going to be perfectly positioned because I was able to use that tool in order to place it. All right, so leave a comment below. Let me know what you thought, or if you have any questions about anything we talked about. I love having that conversation with you guys. I'll link to some other videos on this page or some other fundamental things you might find helpful. But as always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.